Hi, I'm Laurie A. Couture, author of Instead of Medicating and Punishing, and the upcoming book, Nurturing and Empowering Our Sons. Today we're going to talk about a hot topic, violence. What's at the root of it? What's the cause? And most importantly, is there anything we can do to prevent violence? Well, the answers might make a lot of people uncomfortable. The reality is, we all come into this world ready to love and loving. It's violence, fear, and trauma that begets more violence. It's at the root. In other words, childhood developmental trauma is at the root of all forms of violence. Family violence, community violence, suicide, homicide, racism, most mental health issues as well, including children's emotional, behavioral, and learning problems, especially for boys and young men. Developmental trauma harms children on every holistic level. It harms them on their epigenetic level, which means that trauma is more powerful than genetics. It's more powerful than your DNA. It affects the way genetics express themselves. So in addition to it affecting them on the epigenetic level, it affects children neurologically, physically, psychologically, behaviorally, socially, sexually, morally, ethically, spiritually. It causes deleterious harm to the blueprint of who your child was going to be and affects all of their relationships negatively for the rest of their life. In essence, it rewires the brain. Trauma is a very individualized phenomenon. What's traumatizing to one person may not be traumatizing to another, and vice versa. Childhood trauma occurs when a child is powerless to cope with one intense incident of distress or chronic distress. Trauma also occurs on a cycle. It starts with distress that then triggers a limbic system reaction. The limbic system triggers cortisol and other powerful stress hormones, which then cause and trigger a fight, flight, or freeze reaction. This is a survival reaction. This is not something we want children to be experiencing, especially on a chronic basis. This can lead to dissociation. So this cycle causes emotional injury, which we know as trauma. Trauma negatively impacts health outcomes decades later for children. Traumas include professionally recognized traumas such as child abuse and neglect, physical, sexual, and emotional abuse and neglect. Obviously, these are huge traumas for children. They also include loss of a parent, abandonment by a parent, or alienation of a parent, bullying and exposure to community violence, and exposure to sexually explicit and violent media. That's why all of this violence in the media right now is causing indelible harm to children. It's not a positive for them. There are also many overlooked traumas that professionals are really slow. They're just starting to understand are traumatic. Why are they traumatic? Because they raise those cortisol levels and cause fight, flight, or freeze reactions in children. These include traumatic parenting practices such as male genital mutilation, physical punishment, screaming or yelling at your child, lack of skin-to-skin and emotional nurturance such as a lack of breastfeeding, a lack of co-sleeping, causing your child to cry it out at night. Punitive, permissive, or helicopter parenting can be traumatic. Emotional withdrawal from children, especially from boys, and early separation due to daycare or school. There are traumatic educational practices, including that early separation from parents. In school, children's biological needs are delayed and denied and regimented. This is traumatic. It causes cortisol spikes for children. School is punitive. There's a lack of play and movement and a lack of sensory stimulation. This is all traumatizing to children, jacks up their cortisol levels. We also have many trauma-promoting mental health practices, trauma-promoting medical practices, and trauma-promoting public policy practices. Some of these include reflexive psychotropic medicating in the mental health field, ignoring the the unmet needs of children and how the family and school dynamics are at the root of most of these symptoms that children are suffering. Ignoring trauma and attachment disruption. Trauma-promoting medical practices include male genital mutilation, doctors removing healthy, functioning parts of a boy's body, ignoring the severity of screen use in children, ignoring trauma's effects on behavior, body, and health, and many other trauma-promoting medical practices. Trauma-promoting public policy practices include what we talked about. Violence against males, boys and men and young men, is almost virtually ignored in public policy. In fact, just the fact that male genital mutilation is legal at all, it right there is, sexist and a trauma-promoting practice. Corporal punishment is legal of children, but the same act is illegal against grown adults. There's a lack of rights for fathers. Male and female victims of sexual and domestic violence not treated equally. Male and female defendants of sexual and domestic violence are not treated equally. There's very little justice for boys and young men and child abuse victims when a female is the perpetrator. So unfortunately, all of these practices also harm children, and whether or not they're overlooked or not, they're still doing harm to children. Another important piece to discuss in trauma is understanding that a insecure parent-child attachment relationship is also traumatizing to children. The attachment cycle is something that's innate and inherent to all mammals, including humans, and it's simply a cycle, like a circle, of the child has a need, the child expresses the need either through crying or telling or acting out or a number of different ways that children let us know that something's wrong, and then the third step is the only step of that cycle where we as parents can intervene, and that's when the parent responds with sensitivity and meets the need. And then the fourth part of that cycle is child then feels at homeostasis because parent helped them meet the need. When a child feels homeostasis, all systems inside and out feel good. The child feels calm, they feel safe, there's a sense of trust, and they may feel joy from that. And that feeling of that cycle results in what's called secure attachment. Unfortunately, though, most of the children in our culture are suffering from what's called an insecure or disrupted attachment. And that's on that cycle, but there's a couple of broken pieces of that cycle. So the first two parts are the same. The child has a need, the child expresses his or her need, but in the bottom here, the third part, the only part where we can intervene, the parent delays or fails to meet the need. So it's like it puts an X there. So instead of homeostasis coming around, the child feels more distress and increased distress. They feel mistrust, dysregulation, disequilibrium. They're feeling angry, anxious, and maybe even a sense of rage. And when that happens, especially when it's either one time that's extremely intense or a chronic cycle, inconsistent secure attachment, that creates what's called insecure or disrupted attachment. Why is this important to understand? Because attachment disruption is developmental trauma. So let's talk a little bit about love and fear. There are two human emotions, love and fear. Everything comes back to those two. As we discussed, fear is at the root of trauma. Love, on the other hand, is absolutely at the root of the secure attachment cycle. Love is at the root of everything wonderful and good. And fear is at the root of violence and hatred. What we need to do as parents is, it's important for us to parent according to nature's intent. What does nature want for that attachment cycle? What are the needs that nature says that children have, and how do we meet those needs? It's not about our parenting philosophy. It's not about what we want. It's not about what we think is best because that's what we think, or we're following trends or parenting philosophies or what we want. And it's certainly not about passing on that unhealthy cycle that we were raised with. It's about nature's intent. What do children need to thrive? And I'll give you a hint. Almost everything about our educational system does not meet the needs of children and goes against nature's intent. And most of mainstream parenting also goes against nature's intent. So we need to really start there and revamp that. Also, when it comes to dealing with one another in society, we need to focus on love, because if we keep responding with more fear, more violence, we keep triggering that fear, that limbic system fear, which in adults is rooted in their early childhood trauma. So really, love is the only way to heal our society, by healing children who have been traumatized, by preventing trauma in the next generation of children, and by helping one another in a spirit of love. I believe that love is the answer. Racial unity, unity with all types of people, a whole diversity of people, compassion, empathy, open dialogue, listening to one another. I want to end with a quote from my son, Bryson Robert Ryland Couture. Bryson took his life in September of 2017 as a result of early childhood trauma that occurred for many years before he was adopted into our family. Bryson was only 18 when he gave this quote. Such wise words for a teenage boy, young man. Bryson said, "If every action you made had loving intentions, if every move we made was born of love, the world would be healed, the world would be whole."